Hi, I'm Finney and Burnett,
And I am Andrew Buckley.
and we're here today to talk about the fine art of giving feedback, something that we both have a lot of experience in.
We do. We do this a lot. Well, we do this with each other. We do it with story coaching students. We've done it at conferences. We give and receive in equal amounts, you and I, Finn.
Yes, absolutely. I am a longtime teacher. I was a college instructor for several years, longtime presenter, speaker, story coach. So I have a lot of experience giving feedback to people in a way that hopefully doesn't leave them devastated and running for the hills and swearing to never write again.
And I like giving my opinion to people.
And
No, I have lots of experience too, I swear.
you're so very good at both giving your opinion to people.
You have a good opinion, you should share it. I mean, that's only fair.
Yes. So today we're going to be talking about the fine art of giving and receiving feedback on behalf of Alexandra Writers Center Society.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't know you want to be add to that. Yes, we are. That is
I
exactly what we're here to
I
do.
did kind of pause there because
You
to give myself feedback, I almost didn't say Alexandra Writers Center Society correctly, and then I had to pause and rethink about if I had said it correctly.
Well, I actually think it still came through as Alexander Writer Shenter's. So
I was doing
it's
my
entirely
Sean Connery
possible it sounds
impersonation, obviously.
welcome to the Alexander Writer Shenter Society.
So, our goal for today is to teach people how to give feedback in a way that supports other writers without stealing their voice, but also helps them to bring their writing to another level or to help them tell the story in a way that will be accessible to a wider audience, maybe.
Because it's really important. I mean, not writing is such a solo endeavor, always feels like a solo endeavor when you're doing it. But the fact is, without feedback, without some critique, without, other people sharing their opinions of your work, I mean, how do you really know if you've, dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's? How do you know if you've actually found, the plot holes in your own story? Because most of the time you're too close to it to even see the plot holes in your own story because you've written it, you've spent so much time with it. So it's important to seek out feedback from individuals that you trust.
I often think that we know what we meant. And so sometimes when we're reading our own work, it of course makes perfect sense to us, but when someone else reads it, maybe it doesn't make the most sense in the world.
Everything makes sense in your own brain all the time.
Exactly. And most of your work makes sense to me, most of it, because, we do have quite a history with each other as far as giving and
We
receiving
do.
feedback.
We have a rapport.
Yes. I might be a little more positive than you. You might be a little more pointed.
Yeah, well, no, I don't think that's true. I think I'm very positive when I give feedback and critique. Say pointed. Say mine.
No, you actually, your feedback on my book, my one gay novel, made me go back to working on it in a way that I had kind of lost the love for it. And I was thinking, I'm just going to put this aside and just never do anything with it again. And then, as kind of a last ditch measure, I'm like, I'm just going to send it to you and just be honest and tell me what you think. And then your feedback was equally helpful and positive. Like, yes, this does deserve you putting more work into it. Don't throw it away. And that kind of gave me the impetus to keep going with it. And I've just recently sent it to my agent. So,
Well, I think that's also part of the problem, though, is that people hit fatigue with their own work. Like when they've worked at it, and after a while, you lose sight of whether you even think it's any good or not. And sometimes it does take just that little bit more of a push, a little bit of encouragement, or a little bit of feedback and critique to, get it rolling again and get it to completion.
yeah. So, why don't we
Mhm.
go on to talk with people about how they can give feedback to each other?
Let's do that. We're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to talk about the rules of critiquing. This is something I think we both share with classes when we teach writing classes because it's important that there are some rules around when we provide feedback and also when we receive feedback. So we're going to take a look at a couple of different things: critiquing rules, how to be constructive, and what to ask for when we're receiving feedback. And then we'll go from there.
It's
And
always
we'll have
good.
any questions at the end. If anybody would like to ask any questions, even though we can't hear or see you, we'll obviously we'll be happy to answer
We'll
those.
pretend there's questions and then we'll
We
just
will. We
answer
will.
so we can ask each other
Oh
questions.
yes, yes. What did you say? What is that over there on the right? Yeah.
All right. So, the first thing we'll talk about will be sort of the rules. And of course, by rules, we mean guidelines, suggestions. The first one I want to talk about is the idea of being specific and constructive. So, in all of my classes, I ask my students to not say, this doesn't work, because while it may not work, that doesn't actually help anybody. What you can say instead is, I'm not understanding this character's motivation, or I haven't been able to figure out what the hook is in your intro. And then you can offer suggestions for improvements.
Yeah, you can't just be hard and fast with it. It doesn't work that way because that's statement of fact. Saying this doesn't work is statement of fact, and you can't say that because it's an opinion and it's not fact. So you can say that you feel this isn't working for you, but you can't outright state that it doesn't work. That doesn't work. So it's you got to be specific about what the problems are, and you got to be constructive about the feedback you're providing.
Yeah, without a doubt. So I always start with positives. I like to begin the feedback
Because you're
by
so positive.
you know what? Also because I have had both negative and positive people give feedback on my work. And even though I do like getting critique that highlights things that I've missed, I feel seen by people who have positive things to say. So, for example, when you came back on my one gay novel and said, this is fantastic. I love this character. I love the dichotomy here, and I love the way you develop this here. I felt like you got what I was going for. And then I was kind of more open to receiving you as far as the critique that you gave me.
Yeah, I think it goes a long way to legitimize the source of the critique. I think when it starts on a positive note. I mean, you and I do this weekly with our collaborative writing. We always highlight our positives first when we're talking about each other's chapters, and it does. It's just starting things. I mean, you don't want to be you don't want to start a critique and be like, all right, it's all absolutely garbage. Everything is garbage. It's absolutely garbage. It's on fire. It's fiery garbage. It's not good. That'd be hard. How would you even proceed from that point onwards? It wouldn't work. So you got to start with a positive note.
Yeah, and I've even actually self-critiqued myself harsher than you and saying I just feel that the ending, chapter 13 is done, but I feel the ending doesn't hit. And then you'll look at it and say,
That's
no,
true.
I think the ending's really great. One thing we could do here to make it a little more of a cliffhanger, you know.
Yeah, exactly. It's just about the guidance of it. Like you say, it's not rules. It is very much guidelines, but it is very helpful to hear that. Okay, well, if you don't feel this is working, here's some ways that we can improve it, and or here's some suggestions as to what we could potentially do here.
Yeah.
Mhm. Positive language.
You're fantastic at this one.
Prioritizing major issues. Um, yes, because I'm a big structure freak. So I'm always going to look at the story before I'm going to look at the minor things like grammar, punctuation, and wait, is this even true? Even now, I'm saying this, I'm like, but because I immediately went to formatting, I'm like, I can't even read unless it's formatted correctly. But at the same time, I am very focused on story structure when it comes down to it because it's if it's the bigger issues, I mean, things like grammar and punctuation and sentence structure can all be fixed and repaired. That's very technical in a lot of ways, more than it is creative. But the story structure stuff, if the story structure is not working, if the through lines aren't there, if the story arcs aren't complete, if the loops aren't being closed on your plot points, then there's going to be bigger issues. So prioritizing those is always a good way to start rather than focusing on little niggly things that might be, eating away at your brain, like fin not formatting stuff correctly. Um, it's best to try and ignore those. Although I don't with you because
You
I
don't
will
with
rig
me,
you.
no.
No, I'll drag you over the coals for 5 minutes first. But that's just our relationship. Um, but when it gets down to it, the structure is going to be the priority piece. So any major things, major problems with characterization, structure, plot, those should be addressed first.
This is also super important when you have classes, for example, where people are sharing first drafts or doing generative writing and then sharing those. Because if you're spending time focusing on things like typos and spelling and that sort of thing, you're causing issues for people who maybe English is their second language and they'll
Yeah.
get to all of that stuff in editing, but in first draft, let's focus on the stuff that really matters, like the story. And then also just people who are in that spur of the moment. I'm in a generative writing. Now I'm going to share. Don't tell me I spelled something wrong. Tell me about what you think about the story itself.
Yes, save that for later so you can make fun of them at a later date.
You
Make a note of
even
it, maybe.
made you even made fun of me on something I didn't send you for feedback. I was just like, "Hey, look at this idea." And you were like, "I can't until I fix your formatting." And I was like, "Well, at least I got free formatting."
I can't look at this document. I just can't.
My eyes.
It's hurting my soul.
All
Good.
right. Oh,
Oh,
here,
you're
you can.
you're very well. You're very good at this. I can highlight you as somebody who speaks in a very very supportive tone. I mean, I'm very supportive, but I speak in a cynical tone naturally. So, but you are somebody who is very supportive. It's why you're the more popular of our pair, I'm pretty sure. Um, because it's very much when you're giving feedback, you want to lean into this because again, it's that same thing. If you're going to go in negatively, it's not going to work. I had an editor once, or sorry, I worked with an editor who I used to assign out to some projects, who was blatantly scathing, and he was scathing because he didn't know any other way to be. So he was an excellent editor, like to a fine point, but the way that he communicated was never in a supportive tone. He would be cynical and sarcastic and cunning, and he made more than one author cry. Um, but his editing was like crazy on point. So I would only put him with authors who had very thick skin and could take that kind of critique tone. But realistically, the vast majority of people, like 99%, are going to need their feedback in a supportive tone, using phrases like consider this or maybe you should try, more suggestive than this is wrong or this doesn't work. Like drawing those hard lines is always going to be a mistake. And I find you do this very well. You're always very supportive of, well, maybe we could do this and, or maybe we should try that. Or how about if we did this? Like it's much more uplifting than it is, pushing people down.
Yeah, I hate the you should in critique because no, I should not do anything. I will do what I want. My like instant cat comes out if somebody tells me oppositional defiance disorder, right? Like even if I was going to do it, now that you've told me I should do it, I'm not going to do it. So I get
Even
that.
if it's right, no.
Exactly. Like
You should walk up a small short pier. It's
yes.
definitely not. Yeah,
Exactly.
I get it.
But I really like the what if because that kind of encourage our experiment. You know, you have this character. What if you did this with this character? And so I'm not saying you should do it, but I'm saying why don't you experiment with writing it that way and see what happens? You might not end up keeping it that way, but it might bring out something new and exciting.
Agreed. Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Examples. I mean, I think it's I don't know any editors that don't do this because I'd be really shocked if someone was like, you know what, I feel that the tone is off in, 50% of your novel, but not showing any examples as to why would be a really weird thing to do by not having any evidence to back up your statement. This is simple, proving the hypothesis. You have to provide examples to demonstrate, why you think this might need to be changed, or why this might be a plot hole, or why this might be structurally weak, or. You need to provide examples of work on the positive and the negative side. Like you think something's working, like I always highlight pieces when I'm working with story coach students of stuff that I was like, I love this line is glorious, because you want that as well as you want this sentence does not make a ton of sense. I've read it several times. Like, is there a way that we can possibly restructure this so that it makes more sense? It's just important to have those examples to back up your statements.
Yeah, I think so too. Even just on a personal level, I do enjoy getting editorial letters, but if it's just a letter with no track changes in the document, it doesn't
No.
I could just see this whole wall of text, and then I'm like, I don't even know where to start with. Like, oh, this character isn't likable. You need to change that. You know, like, give me some ideas.
How? How? Where? Why?
Because I
Reasoning.
like him. All
Totally true.
right. Um, I think asking questions is one of the best ways to approach feedback, especially
Absolutely.
if someone's writing from a different lived experience and there's just things that you don't understand in their work. That asking questions, instead of saying this doesn't make sense, you need to change it, you're asking what this means, and then the author has a chance to figure out if they need to add more clarifying information.
Also, it's nobody likes being just talked at. Like if you're giving feedback, you should always make it more conversational. It should never be just you like, I am the grand editor of all the worlds, and here is my thought process and why this is the way it is. It's meant to be a two-way street. It's meant to be something that, you can ask questions about to help clarify maybe the intention. Like it maybe something made perfect sense to you in your brain, and your editor is like, well, I don't think it makes sense. Having the conversation, the back and forth where they can ask questions of you is going to be a good way to actually, maybe find out why it was working for you, but why it might not be working for somebody else. It just helps clarify things like that. You can't find the gold unless you dig for it. Like it's just part of the process. So asking questions is a great way to do that.
I feel that the way that you just explained that was very accessible.
Oh,
I-
thank you very much.
I'm
I
giving you
appreciate
feedback right now
the positive feedback.
in real
Tell me more
time.
about how I'm doing such a great job.
Well, and in the spirit of asking questions, why don't we, or how do you feel about going to the next session?
I feel that it'd be a great idea to go on to the next slide.
All right. So now we're going to talk about, we've talked about giving, now equally important, the art of receiving.
Yes,
And
very,
me
very important.
flying through the slides,
Just going through, and we're going to do it very, very quickly.
all willy-nilly, just all the way to the end in 30
Brace
seconds.
yourself. Uh,
Um, you go ahead,
how,
take this.
well, before we start this, like, how has your experience been with receiving feedback? Like I mean, when we work together, you're always very, very open to receiving feedback. I've been in situations where I've been extremely open to it because I love working with editors. I've also worked with some people where I'm like, I don't think these people know what they're talking about, and I've been less open. What's your experience been with this?
I feel that I'm at the point in my career, and I would say early in my career was very different, my ability to take feedback. Because first of all, I felt very sensitive about the work and I didn't have that ability to trust myself. And so if someone said something, I would just automatically change it. And one of the things I wish I had known earlier that just kind of comes very natural to me now is having this innate understanding of who's giving me great feedback and who doesn't know what they're talking about. So when I get feedback that doesn't stay true to what I really innately know about the story, I'm able to dismiss it, but I kind of always take that step back in the beginning anyway, instead of getting defensive. I had one beta reader who told me that the character Oliver in my book, Arthur Undressed, was irrelevant and didn't need to be there, that he could have just been eliminated from the manuscript. And I just kind of took a step back and thought about it for a few minutes and then realized that it wasn't that he was irrelevant, it was that I hadn't done enough to build his relevance in the story in the way that he, in my heart, he really was integral to the story, but I hadn't made it come across on the page. So kind of like taking the curiosity of like, well, this is someone I know who wouldn't hurt me on purpose, who
Yeah.
generally gives me good feedback. To say that a character was irrelevant, there was a reason for it. How about you? I
No, that's
know that
fair.
you're good at taking feedback from me at least.
I'm going to take feedback from anyone, and I do stay open minded. And I think staying open minded is important when people are giving you feedback. You've got to you just got to kind of remember that it's not they're never trying to hurt your work, or I would assume no editor or nobody giving you feedback is trying to hurt your process. So it's important to stay open minded with it, but in the end, it's still also your story. And if you feel that a critique isn't something that you want to accept, or you don't think it's going to make the story better, you're well within your rights to be like, no, I mean, I appreciate the feedback, but I don't think this is going to improve my story. It's your due diligence to do that. It's your ownership. It's your narrative. Nobody else owns your story except for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really important to ask clarifying questions, take a lot of notes, ask for
Mhm.
examples. If someone says something about your critique and you either don't agree or don't understand, sometimes it could just be the message getting lost.
It could be. Yeah, that's entirely possible. And I think the only way to get around that is to ask questions. I think if you just sit there and blatantly just, take the notes and accept whatever they're saying without asking for clarification, and you don't understand something, like, it's this one's a bit of a common sense one, I suppose, but you should ask clarifying questions.
Yeah. In grad school, one of my cohort was doing a project on exploding the whole MFA program's model of silent critique. And so the model in
Oh,
MFA program is that you sit there and people critique your work and you're not allowed to say anything back to them, and how that really inhibits people's voices and also doesn't benefit the critique because people aren't allowed to engage it as a conversation. I think having clarifying questions and being allowed to engage makes the feedback that much richer.
always, 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 always. Like, how can you get to the bottom of a plot point that's not working if you're not going to ask the questions as to why?
Yeah. Sort of like you asking me, what the heck are you trying to do here in that one chapter when I just had that random thing thrown in that took us totally off plot that time.
Oh, that's right. That was recent too. Like, I don't know where you're going with this. I feel like you have something in your head that, might work, but I don't know what you're doing.
You asked clarifying questions.
Ask clarifying questions.
Oh, this is
Oh,
so hard sometimes.
yes, because you are not your work. While all of our work always feels like our own baby, and, editing often feels like we're cutting limbs off babies. It's a terrible visual. You shouldn't take feedback personally. You have to be able to separate yourself from your work. I've never this got like hard boiled into us in film school, which was my first formal writing education. So I've always been very good at this, being that you never really own your work when it comes to screenwriting. Anyways, it's always going to be somebody else's. So you can't take anything personally. But it's harder to do, especially for a lot of novelists. Because especially if the story is personal. I mean, I write about goblins and trolls and crap. You write stuff that is deeply personal to you, so it would be harder, I think, with the kind of stuff that you write, to not take things personally. Because how would you not take something that you've written from a personal standpoint and not take it as a personal attack on you when somebody's like, I don't think this is realistic or this doesn't work? How do you deal with that?
I think it's one of those things where you really do have to separate yourself from the work, even when it is deeply personal. I have written actual creative nonfiction that is a true story and have had people, like taking it to people, can you beta read this for me? And then I have to work with the understanding that they are not critiquing the true story, they're critiquing my presentation of the true story.
Right.
And that's what you really, it can be so difficult, but it is integral to getting better as a writer, is learning that if you worked in corporate payroll and somebody came to you and said you didn't do this tax return correctly, you wouldn't take it as a personal attack and go into the doldrums for 2 weeks. You would just be like, okay, show me how to do it correctly.
I
That's
didn't
where we
love my
would.
tax return.
I know.
Why? Cruel world.
Please, please let me do these taxes correctly.
Yeah, it does take some practice in some cases to not take things personally, because again, it's your work, you created it, it's your baby. It is a little difficult when people are like, I don't like this character, but I love that character. It can be tricky, but you just got to do that split and get used to doing it. And it's going to take a little bit of practice in some cases.
Yeah. And know that sometimes it is okay to get the feedback and then go be sad for a couple of hours and then come back to it. It is all right. We're not dismissing your feelings.
No, no, that is totally okay.
Um, I like this one, the idea of looking for patterns, because if one person gives you feedback on something, then it is possible just a subjective difference of opinion. But if a lot of people point out the same sort of thing, this is probably something you need help on. I always have people tell me, I love your characters, but they could be anywhere in the world because the setting does not engage me. And so that's something I always have to work on because I've had so many people give me feedback on that. I know that's a weakness of mine.
That makes sense. And it's also a good way to just highlight structural issues with a story. Like if you're getting the same feedback that I don't understand why this happens, or this isn't getting here for me, and you hear that two or three times from different people, then you got to consider that is, target audience feedback. It's people who are reading it from an unbiased point of view. And if they're all finding the same thing, then it's kind of hard to deny that maybe there's an issue there. So it's important. So if you do find patterns through feedback, it would be important to address those for sure.
Yeah. And then this kind of goes along with that, not taking it personally, that give
Are we good at
yourself
this?
time. Are we
Just
what?
are we good at this? Just for clarification, like are we
You mean us
uh,
personally between us?
yeah. Yeah, are we good at waiting before responding? Not necessarily to each other, but in general. I feel like we talked to each other off ledges before, is why I'm asking
Oh, yeah.
about
So
waiting to respond to things.
I'm good at this to outward appearances. So if someone gives me harsh feedback, I don't then, immediately respond. But what I will ultimately do is message you and be like, rah, rah,
Yeah,
rah, rah,
that's
rah,
fair.
rah, rah. And then I can present I'm not really sure I understand what you mean by.
That's fair. That's totally fair.
That's what writer friends are for, right? To take that.
Exactly. Yeah. First line of defense. But you're right. It does tie into the don't take it personally. And so if again, if you feel that you need to go and rock in a corner for 45 minutes, that's totally okay. But don't knee jerk react to something that you disagree or you don't think is a valid point. Like take some time, process it. We all take time to process things. If we look at things from different perspectives, you're going to probably see it differently than you would just straight up face value. So, take a little bit of time before you respond to any kind of harsh critique. It's just good rule of thumb.
And also understand that it might not even be harsh. Some people just have different ways of expressing. I have a dear friend who's German who gives feedback to my students all the time in the academy I run. And she always says, if I don't say something's wrong, that's praise. So you're never going to get this is a good job from her. You're going to get there's nothing marked for a page. So therefore she liked that page. So
High praise,
everything
high praise.
yeah, everything's gonna feel harsh, but she doesn't mean it harshly. So
It's so funny.
I don't have her critique my stuff though. Like I thrive on the praise.
That's totally fair.
So I think that this kind of goes back to what you and I both talked about, which is
Yeah.
learning what feedback to take and what not to take.
Yeah. I think when people are starting out, and what I found when I taught novel writing classes from brain to book, when it's been from concept to starting, I think people are always like very look, well, if I get feedback, I have to accept, I have to accept it. You do not need to feel any kind of ownership or onus to actually accept every single piece of feedback you get. So when you're receiving critiques, you don't have to agree with all. You should consider everything because you just never know until you actually take things into consideration. But in the end, your story is your story. Accept whatever you think is going to make it better, and you can absolutely dismiss the rest, and that is totally okay.
Yeah. Um, so I guess let's go ahead and move on to the idea of what questions to give to editors or beta readers or anyone who might be reading your work when you're submitting it for feedback.
Yeah, so when it comes down to plot, does the order of events make sense? Do you get an idea of rising action, climax, falling action? Just ask them straight up plot related questions to find out if, it is all working. I have had some editors, not many, admittedly, but I have had some where I've had to kind of draw it out of them a little bit to have them give me more well-rounded feedback as opposed to just specific bullet pointed stuff. So I found that asking these kinds of questions has helped.
Yeah, I do. I think you're right. I think it depends on what you're looking for from the feedback. So if you are interested, like you said about the plot, if you want to know how they feel about the characters, you ask, what is the character's main goal, those sort of things. Do these things come through for you? If you feel
Mhm.
comfortable in your characters, but you're not sure about your plot events, that's where you're going to start asking these specific questions for sure.
Yeah, and when it comes to the world building stuff in particular, because world building is such a big part of spec fiction, but in just in general, of writing as a whole, like it doesn't matter if you write literary or anything else, the world building is always going to be there. Everybody thinks world building thinks sci-fi and magical worlds and fantasy and stuff. It's not. It's related to everything. And you have to make sure that your descriptive that goes with that world building is in place. So asking questions about settings, about engaging senses, about writing from that grounded, what can you see, what can you smell, what can you hear, standpoints are all good questions to ask when it comes to trying to improve your world building in your writing.
Yeah, it's so important. I read a book once that was set in a very specific, very unique place, and then it was set in a very specific time frame. But then the book itself didn't engage with either of those two very unique things. So it left me wondering, why didn't you just set this in present day in some random city? It was just a
Yeah,
very, very interesting kind of omission that you picked something so unique and interesting, but then didn't engage with it.
that is a weird choice. Why
Yeah.
would you? I mean, it's not part of the story, then why even set it in a different time
Yeah.
period or place?
Yeah. For
Good question
dialogue,
to ask.
oh yeah, I know, right? Like I feel like I should email the author and ask. Now, for dialogue, I think that this is important both when you're reading and when you're asking for feedback, because dialogue is one of those ones that can be so clunky, and a lot of people try to put a lot of information in dialogue, and sometimes it comes out being things that the other character should know, and it belongs in the narrative, not in the dialogue. So reading your dialogue aloud is one of the things that I think is one of the best things you can do before you ask for feedback on it.
Yeah, but when you do have it, I mean, obviously ask the questions as to whether you think or whether the editor believes that the dialogue is even working in the first place. Because we all, and it's a tricky part of dialogue because we do all hear things in different tones. And as much as writers, we're going to try and deliver our dialogue or write our dialogue so that we hear it or that the reader hears it in the same voice that we are hearing it in our own head. It is one of the more subjective pieces because you can never judge. I mean, how many times have you read a book and then listened to the audiobook and like, no, that's not how I pictured that character sounding at all. And maybe for better or for worse. So it is important to ask those questions, but just remember there is subjectivity around dialogue, and that's not always going to be a hard, fast feedback piece.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the dialogue in your fairy tales because the both reading your fairy tales and listening to the audiobook of it is such a delightful
Yeah.
experience. Of course, the voice actor in that is also just ridiculously intelligent or ridiculously talented, but
Yeah, Lewis does a wonderful job of those. But again, it's tone, right? I mean, I read it in, I mean, he does a very good job of, but I also knew that I wanted kind of a Stephen Fry-esque kind of thing. And when I read it in my brain, that's kind of what I like the narrator to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's that. And Lewis does a good job of doing very similar to that. So, but I don't know how many books I've read, and now in listening to the audiobooks, I'm like, wow, this is so different than I expected because of the dialogue tone. Really does
yeah.
shift it.
Yeah, so you really have to make sure that that sort of thing comes through so that when you do have things like the audiobook that the person's
Mm-hmm.
going to get it. Yeah. So my final thoughts on feedback are it is so valuable to both partake in feedback on both levels, to be the giver and to be the receiver. Even a possibly not great feedback can still help you learn. You can still learn what you know about your story or where you stand firm in your story. Or there might be, nuggets of gold in the feedback that maybe the feedback itself wasn't all around helpful, but maybe they did pick up on something that you wondered about. Oh, yeah, I didn't really think that that character came through really well. And then conversely, I think giving feedback teaches you to look at your own work in a different light. And when you see certain errors come through over and over again on other writers, you're going to start seeing it in your own work as well. What do you think?
I've never not learned something by working with an editor or somebody who gives me feedback. Like it's always a learning experience, for better or for worse. And even the for the worst experiences, you still learn something from it. So I think it's really important that people practice feedback, giving and receiving. Like if you've never receive feedback before, I mean, be open-minded to it. If you've never given feedback before, become a beta reader for somebody, or trade with somebody, another writer, and read each other's work. Because that process, like you said, is a great learning experience. It helps improve your own writing while also helping improve other people's writing. I've worked with some fantastic editors that I've just learned from, and it's always been a really empowering educational experience as a writer. So I encourage people to do this back and forth because it really does help you in your own craft, your own technical ability as a writer. It's an important piece.
And there are so many ways to do feedback through Alexandra Writer Center Society classes. A lot of them are geared toward critique or generative writing and then sharing the generative writing. So I highly recommend taking a look at the schedule of classes, not just for mine and Andrew's classes, although ours are really wonderful.
Really good, really good. Mm-hmm.
And thank you so much for listening to us and hope to see you at one of our classes.